Sorry about the technological problems. So we're going to talk about idolatry, and an important warning before I begin is I wasn't going to do it. So all that effort to get the PowerPoint up there was really not worth it because I didn't have a PowerPoint, and then 2 hours ago I'm like, oh, you know what? It would really help. So this is the worst PowerPoint I've ever done. You can see it's the default theme. There's no font, there's no background or anything. And I reused pictures, and there are parts where you'll see where I just gave up. So it's really just there to remind me of what to talk about. But I'm mentioning it because, one, to excuse the horrible PowerPoint, but also because there's lots of places, another way you can tell that it's very quickly prepared is there's lots of places where instead of having a quote or a point, I just have discuss, right? Which is a good way of filling in when I haven't prepared a point or I haven't managed to find a quote in time. I just get you guys to say stuff, right? So it actually will be really important. I'm kind of I'm semi-serious, but I'm kind of joking as well. But it's a serious point in that I generally learn a lot better by discussing things. So I would really appreciate it if you can think with me through the stuff that we're going to talk about, because it's a topic that I think is only going to be useful if it maps onto your actual onto our actual lives in some way or other, right? So we're going to talk about what idolatry is, what an idol is in a biblical sense in the Old Testament. So that's going to be the really basic literal meaning of idolatry, worshipping idols. But then, as always is the case in Orthodox Christianity, there's layers to things, right? So there's the idea of idols and worshipping them, but then that has a spiritual meaning, that has a spiritual significance that beneath the obvious level. So that's kind of what we're going to start with, the literal physical level, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper, and that's where I'm really going to need your help. Okay, so let me just start by defining idolatry. So you do next slide. Okay, so it's really simple, right? If you do a search for the word idolatry or idols in the Bible, it's almost always discussed in the context of the Old Testament, right? It's a story we're all familiar with. So Israel is the people of God, and so they're supposed to worship God, who they call Jehovah, Yahweh, and they're not supposed to worship any other gods. That's the first commandment, right? You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or in the earth beneath or the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. What is that referring to? Why is there all this stuff here about not making a likeness of things above the earth or under the earth or whatever? It's because the big temptation in the time of the ancient Israelites was to worship gods who had physical images. So a little bit of context. If you want to go to the next slide. So this is an example from Greece, but it's equally true of the pagan nations around Israel in the time of the Old Testament. But virtually all the religions at that time, they, the central, in the same way that we have church buildings, their main religious building was a temple. And there were lots of things in the temple, but the center of the temple was always the image of the god to whom that temple was dedicated. So hopefully you recognize that building. Has anyone here been to Athens? Back before COVID was a thing? So yeah, you probably saw, even if you didn't visit it, you would have seen the Parthenon it's one of the tourist attractions. So the Parthenon was a temple back in the day, and it was a temple to the goddess Athena. And so we only know from little accounts here and there what was actually in the temple. But that is a life-size reconstruction. So I don't know if you can see the statue of Athena. See the little figure next to it? That's a human being. So it was it's 3 or 4, 5, 6 times the size of an actual normal human being. Yeah. So that's an example of. That's all the way in Greece, but that's how temples were structured. The most important thing in a temple is the image or the idol of the god to whom that temple is dedicated. You can see that in lots of places in the Old Testament. One of the really interesting ones is, when the ark gets stolen. So this is in 1 Samuel from memory. And the Israelites are stuffing up and sinning as usual. And so God allows them to lose a battle. And they had the Ark of the Covenant with them in the battle. And then the Philistines end up defeating them and taking the Ark of the Covenant away. And they take the Ark of the Covenant to the house of their God, right? So this is what it actually says in the Oh, sorry, could you go back one slide? Other direction. Spoilers. That's all right. You might want to just download it so that you don't have to. Yeah. Anyway, it's all good. I've got it here. I'll just. So yeah. Anyway, the Philistines. So I'm just reading out from 1 Samuel. The Philistines brought the Ark of the Covenant into the house of Dagon, and Dagon is a fish god. It's a god that the Philistines worshipped. So they brought it to the house of Dagon. What's the house of Dagon? It's the temple of Dagon, and they set it by Dagon. So the way that it's spoken of in the Old Testament, like in the language of this time, is that the God actually lives in the temple, right? So what literally happened, if you went and watched what they did, they took the Ark of the Covenant in and they put it down next to the big image of Dagon that was at the center of the temple to him. And then, of course, the famous, what happens is, when they wake up the next morning, they come into the temple again, and the image has fallen on its face. And so they put it back up, and the next day it's fallen on its face, and its face has fallen off, and its hands have fallen off. Point being that the Ark of the Covenant kind of it's like God and Dagon entered into a little fisticuffs, and God won. So God triumphed over the other God. And this isn't just a thing for the, next slide. This isn't just a thing for the Israelites. This is actually so if you go back to this time in history, if the Philistines conquered some tribe of Canaanites, what they would do to show their victory is they would take the image, they would go to the temple of the chief god of that people, and they would steal the image and take it prisoner. It's like capturing the god. So that's the kind of, that's the context for idolatry in the Old Testament, right? Why is God always telling the Israelites not to worship other gods, not to make carved images? Because they wanted to be like the other nations around them and have a god with an image who they could offer sacrifices to and carry with them into battle. And God refused to give them that, right? The closest they got was the Ark of the Covenant, which is not an image of God. It's just a remembrance of his activity with them. Yeah. All right, cool. Okay, yeah, so could you go to the next slide? The thing is always, what's the problem with idolatry? Why is God so upset when they worship people? Oh, sorry, back one. It's because I reused the image, so it looks like, yeah. Main problem with idols is that you approach them as though they can do something for you, but the emphasis is always when the biblical writers are criticizing idolatry, people who worship idols, the idea is that they're deceived. And the deception is that they're taking something that's clearly not alive, something that's clearly dead and lifeless and unable to help them, and they're treating it as though it could help them. So this is, for example, in Psalm 135, the idols of the nation are silver and gold, the works of men's hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak, and they have eyes, but they do not see, and they have ears, but they do not hear, nor is there any breath in their mouths. And those who make them are like them. So is everyone who trusts in them. So there's something really strange that happens in that when you worship an idol, and it's this lifeless lump of clay or wood, what happens is you become like the idol. That it's a solid, immobile thing that can't speak or hear or anything, and by worshipping it, you start to take on the same characteristics. You start to lose your ability to be free and alive and all of that, and to see and to hear and so on. Obviously not literally, it's not saying that you will go blind if you worship an idol, but he's saying you'll lose your vision, right? You'll lose your sense of what's real and what's true because you're engaging in this fantasy. So the big problem with idols is that they are illusions, right? They're a fantasy. Okay, so that's kind of the Old Testament context. And if you want to spiritually understand what's happening here, next slide. Human beings, another way to think about why idolatry is wrong in the Old Testament, and this is quite important. What's always happening is that what people are doing is they are worshipping, the way that St. Paul puts it, is they're worshipping the creature rather than the creator. So behind every god of every pagan god in the Old Testament times, there's some aspect of creation. So Dagon, like I said, he's a fish god, right? And it's probably because the people who worshipped him, they were big on fishing, right? So they pray to the god of fishing and the god of fishes in order to be able to support their livelihood. And, there's a god of war and a god of farming and a god of whatever, like every aspect of life, there's a god of that thing. And so when you're worshipping that god, when you go to that temple and worship the god of war, for example, it's probably because you've got some reason, like some investment that you've made really depends on how a war will fare, or you're a king and you're about to go on a war, so you're going to go and sacrifice to the god of war. But there's always some aspect of creation that you're giving your soul to in that aspect, like in the act of worshipping that idol. You're trying to control or bring into relationship with you some part of creation. And so what is essentially happening is you're worshipping the thing that God has made without any reference to God himself. And so the basic idea, right, is that none of these things are evil in and of themselves, right? There's nothing wrong with food. War, I suppose, is a bad example because war is pretty bad in and of itself. But there's nothing wrong with food and fish and water and all the other things that there are gods of in the Old Testament. The thing that's wrong with worshipping them is that you're putting them in the place that belongs to God. Where they should be is you should have your eyes focused on God. We should be connected to God and worshipping him. And then everything else kind of comes in around us, right? It's the same principle as seek first the kingdom of God and then all these things will be added to you. If you worship God and he's the one who teaches you how to use water and fish and all of those other things, right? You use the creation the way that it was meant to be created. What happens when you do the opposite is there's this animation which you've seen about 5 times already. But humanity, instead of facing up towards God and then having all these other things as a help, they focus their attention that should be on God onto material things. And so the whole human race is kind of tipped upside down, right? Where it's kind of trying to get water out of a tap from the top of it or something. You turn on the tap and the water's coming out the bottom, but you're holding the cup up the top. You're using the whole system of creation wrong. Okay, cool. And so the reason this is a problem of facing creation rather than facing God is because God is the source of life. If you don't have God, you don't have life. St. Irenaeus puts this really, really nicely. He says, it's not possible to live apart from life, and the means of life is found in fellowship with God. But fellowship with God is to know God and to enjoy his goodness. So it's basically saying, if you are trying to survive by eating food, you have to eat actual food, right? If you don't eat food, then you will die. You can take ashes and chew them up and swallow them, but eventually you'll die because you're not getting actual nourishment out of them. And that's really the only motivation behind God's insisting that people worship him and not any other god. When he says he's a jealous God, it doesn't mean that he's insecure and that he's not like a jealous boyfriend kind of thing who's really afraid of losing control over you. It's actually for your sake that he says, worship no other gods apart from me. The way that he puts it in in Deuteronomy is he says, this isn't on the slide, but he says that you may love the Lord your God and obey his voice, and that you may cling to him, for he is your life and the length of your days. In other words, God is your life. The only way to live and thrive and be a healthy, happy human being is to be in communion with God. And so idolatry is always a way of separating from God, worshipping something other than God and trying to live off that, like eating ashes instead of food. All right, so any questions or comments about all that? That's just the basic, that's what idolatry is in the Old Testament. That's why it's bad, because you're trying to live off things that aren't God. Don't do it, okay? The real question is, what does that have to do with us? Because I don't want to presume, maybe this isn't true for you, but your major temptations probably don't include sacrificing a goat to Zeus. I had a really strong temptation today and I couldn't help myself. I went to the temple of Zeus and I killed a goat and I drained its blood on the altar and everything. I'm trying to stop, but I just really can't. It's so pleasurable and, that's not something that we struggle with anymore like the ancient Israelites did. So the question is, what does this have to do with us? What does all this stuff about not worshipping the creature and not worshipping the creature other than the creator have to do with us? So I'm going to get to that in a moment. I want to first ask I want to get to the question in a kind of roundabout way. So we saw that in all of these ancient cultures, the god of each culture, like Athena, like the example I showed you, has in their temple an image of themselves. And that's what people come to worship. And when they worship it, it's like they're meeting the God face to face. The one exception, I don't know if there are any others, there may be, but the only exception that I'm aware of to this principle that a temple is where the God's image is Israel, right? If you go into the temple of the God of Israel, or if you went into the tabernacle before they built the temple, you wouldn't see an image of Jehovah or Yahweh, right? You would get to the Holy of Holies, well, you'd be dead by the time you got there. You'd have to stop further back. But if you opened up the Holy of Holies, there's no image of Yahweh in there. There's just the Ark of the Covenant. And there's the mercy seat, right? So there's the two cherubim, and that's his throne. But the throne's empty. No one is sitting on the throne. No one's sitting on the ark. So an important question becomes, does God have, does the God of Israel, you can think just in terms of the Old Testament, or you could think New Testament too, because there's a range of possible correct answers. Does the God of Israel have an image, something physical in the physical world that represents him and is like his presence in the world? He does? What is it? It's us. What makes you say that? Yeah, we're created in the image and likeness of God. What's really, really interesting is you'll find this in some of the church fathers. So I was just listening to a podcast about St. Ephrem the Syrian and his hymns on paradise. And the first thing he does when he goes through, so he goes through the Genesis account, and he notes all the similarities between the creation and the temple. So the ocean is like the washing basin that the priest washes his hands in before he does the sacrifice. And the, I forget what's what, but I think one of the veils is like the heavens overstretching, and everything is connected to something. So what he's saying is creation itself is the temple of God. And this is something that actually, so St. Ephrem's noticed it, but a lot of scholars have also noticed that that's, within the way that Genesis 1 is written, it's directly parallel to the description of the temple that you have in Exodus. So the creation is a temple. The creation is a temple to God. And when you read the account of the creation, when you get to the center of the temple at the very end, you have, as you would expect if you were in any ancient culture, you have the image of the God to whom this temple is dedicated. But it's not a statue, it's the human being, right? That's why the human being is in the image and likeness of God. All right, so that was one of the correct answers. Yes, this God does have an image, it's human beings. There's another acceptable answer, though. If I ask you, what's the image of God, or even more specifically, who is the image of God? What do you think? If you want a hint, you can jump to Colossians 1:15. But who is the image of God? If you want to know who God is and you want to look at a human being, who do you look at?
Jesus.
At Jesus, right? This is actually, could you go next slide? This is said multiple times in the New Testament, but Jesus is actually explicitly said to be the image of God. One of the simplest ones is Colossians 1:15. He's the image of the invisible God. But then also in Hebrews 1, 2 or 3, I forget, he's the express image of God, and he's the character of God. You can see God the Father is invisible, obviously, but you can see him through Jesus. And so that's why, FYI, whereas in the Old Testament, you could never have images in the temple, images of God, we have a big icon of Christ and icons of all the saints, and we're much more comfortable with images than they were in the Old Testament. And the reasoning, the theological reasoning for that shift, is that it's not idolatry, because now God is a human being, right? We're worshipping Christ, who took on, he's God, but he took on flesh. And so he's made himself visible. And so all we're doing is we're venerating the incarnation. When we venerate the icons of saints and everything, always, I'm sure you've heard this before, but in Coptic iconography, it's always the facial features are always the facial features of Christ, because what we're venerating is Christ in those people, etc., etc. Okay, cool. So the point that I'm trying to build up to here, right, is that, we don't go and worship Zeus, don't sacrifice goats and that sort of thing. But one of the ways to understand what we're supposed to do as human beings, as good Christian human beings, is we're supposed to be the image of God, and we ourselves are the temple, right? We're the temple, and we have in the center of our heart, or our temple, an image. Some image is going to be sitting in the center of the temple of your heart. And what we want it to be is the image of Christ. That's the goal. That's what we're all striving for. But where we fall into idolatry is not by worshipping Zeus, but by having something other than Christ at the center of that inner temple. And so this is the way when you go to the Desert Fathers and those sorts of writings, like the ascetic Orthodox theology, you find that idols are always spoken of as mental, right? Because they're writing in the 3rd, 4th century, like the pagans aren't really around anymore. Christians aren't going and worshipping literal physical idols. They are putting things in their hearts that aren't God. So this is just one example from, he's complicated, but he's called Macarius Simeon. Light cannot have anything in common with darkness, nor can the temple of God have any common ground with idols. So consider yourself the temple of God, and flee from any image of spiritual idols in your heart. For every affection operating in the soul is an idol. And thus it is well said, if anyone lets himself be dominated by anything, then he is a slave to it. So the temple here is not a physical temple. The temple is you, or more specifically, it's your heart. And the way that you commit idolatry is by having in your temple at the center, in the place of like glory, where the image of the God sits, having something that is not God, something other than God. Yes, okay. Can you go one slide forward and another slide forward? Okay, so here's another slide that clearly was prepared very quickly, because if I had time, I would have found a nice picture of a party. I didn't have time, so I just did emojis that are related to a party. So just pretend there's a nice picture there of a party. But what exactly, in what way do we have images in our hearts? Because I keep referring to that, I'm focusing on this theme of an image. Idolatry is when you have an image in your heart that is enthroned in your heart that's not Christ. What exactly does that mean? So I want to try and give you a sense of when the Church Fathers speak about these images, what exactly are they talking about? In what sense do we have images? So I want you to imagine with me that you are, and I'd like to actually hear what you just play along the thought experiment with me, but pretend you're in a situation where you've been invited to a party, you're going to go, and before it, so you're just about to walk out the door, grab your keys, get in the car to go to the party. You have in your head an image of what the party is going to be like, right? So I'm curious about, it depends on what kind of person you are. If it's me, leave me till the end. But what are you feeling? Tell me what you're, what is your image of the, so you don't know, you haven't been there yet, obviously, you're about to go there. What kind of things are you imagining about the party before you get there? Okay, so you have an image in your head of people laughing, all right? Yeah. So are there visual components to this, anticipation of the party? Can you see images? What sort of images? Okay, yeah. If you know the place the party's at, if it's at a friend's house, you probably have in your head, these people who are laughing, they're set inside that place, right? Okay, so, and there'll be some audio aspects to it, people laughing, there might be loud music, whatever it is, right? You have in your head, what the party is going to be like. You've never seen the party, right? The party could be completely different to what you're imagining it. But as you're walking out the door, before you've got there, you have in your head, at least we've got the visual and the audio part of it. There's another really important part of it though, another part of the image, and this is what determines how you feel about going to the party, is there's an emotional component. It's painted, the image is painted with colors, but it's also painted with emotions. So if it's me, who's a really boring non-party person, and I always get I come home with a hoarse voice because all I do at parties is talk to people, and I have to yell over, I find the most boring person like me on the side, and we sit and have a very loud conversation, and hopefully the music doesn't stop, and then yelling into a quiet room. But if it's me, I'm not, I have to go to this thing, but I would rather be at home. So I'm thinking of this image, and I've got the image of people laughing and dancing and loud music and everything, and it's okay, whatever. I got to go, but not too happy about it. You might have different, and I suppose it depends on the kind of party, it depends on the people, whether they're good people, people you don't like, whatever. You have this sort of emotional sense of what it's going to be like. And the important thing is that image determines your actions, right? If I get enough of that, I don't want to go feeling with that image, I won't go, right? It will actually affect the way that I want to go. affect what I do. If you are really, really keen, that's going to make you really eager, like you'll plan your day so that you make sure you get to the party on time, you'll dress appropriately and everything, right? The emotional component of the image is a big part of like what determines your actions in the lead up to the party. Keep in mind again though, all of this is happening, all of this imagining is happening with no actual information. Well, I suppose you've got like an invitation, but you've got no actual knowledge of what the party will be like, right? We've all had the experience of like you imagine what something's going to be like and then you get there and it's completely different, right? This is all just happening in your head. It's all happening in imagination. Okay, so that example hopefully helps you to kind of relate. That's the theater or the screen in which idolatry happens, according to the church fathers that I'm drawing on. This ability we have to make up images. So that's a really trivial, like silly example, right? But it's just to sort of show you that virtually everything we do, like when you wake up in the morning and you think about going to work, you're doing this. When you wake up in the morning, think about going to church, same thing. When you feel the need to eat something because you're hungry, you do the same thing. You think about food, you think about where you can get it from, all of that. Point is that our life is a constant, like our mental life is a constant stream of images. That's how we engage with the world. And they're not just visual images, they have all sorts of components, especially like an emotional or a felt component. Okay, so where does idolatry come into this? If you go to the next slide. One of the things that, well, many of the church fathers say, this is just one little example, but the way that the demons tempt us, because they want to make us fall into idolatry, is they throw images at your mental screen. They want you to see things and people and events in a certain way. The way that St. Isaac the Syrian puts it is the passions, which is another word for like temptations for our purposes. The passions imprint on the mind images and idols, and this warfare has great force, able to weaken the mind and violently perturb and confuse a man's thinking. So the demons are throwing images at you to make you think about the world around you and events and people in particular ways. So if you think about virtually any like category of sinful activity or behavior, you can almost always find some image of the kind that I'm talking about that precedes it, that comes before it and inspires you to that behavior. So like the classic Coptic example is like a Big Mac during fasting, right? That's preceded by an image of a Big Mac. Like you probably have a visual image, maybe like some McDonald's advertisement music plays in your head. And there's also like a taste component, you remember what it tastes like. And most importantly, like the spiritual component of it is, there's a sense of the pleasure, right? And the pleasure is what, when you succumb to this sin, as we all do, then the pleasure has overpowered your desire to do, like your desire for self-control and to keep the fast, that's overpowered by your desire for this pleasure. And so you basically put that desire above your desire to obey God. That's how the sin happens. If you think of any kind of sin, you'll find a similar sort of pattern, right? Another really good one is anger or like hatred, because they talk a lot about how, like the church fathers I'm drawing on here, they talk a lot about how the demon of anger, in order to make you hate someone, especially when you sit down to pray, will throw the image of someone's face in your mind, someone who's done you wrong, so that the idea being that as you're trying to pray, your prayer is disturbed by you suddenly have this remembrance of like what this person did to you, and you feel, so it's again, there's an image of the person's face, but there is the emotional part is this kind of anger or hatred towards that person, and that interrupts your prayer, gets between you and God. So the point is, right, that these images are neither good nor evil in themselves, right, and just like the fact that we make these images is just part of how we work as human beings, how we think about things. But the demons want us to think and imagine things in certain ways. And if they manage to like implant an image strongly enough, if they get us to see things their way, like consistently, then their image becomes an idol, right? The thing that their way of viewing the world, it's quite terrifying, isn't it? It basically means that you're seeing the world through the demon's eyes if they succeed. You start to view people, like for example, in the example of anger, you start to genuinely hate this person. You no longer see them as an image of God, you see them as an enemy who deserves your wrath and revenge and that sort of thing. Your next slide. So there's lots of examples of that, like I've been saying. So some like quick examples as well. Popularity, wealth, even things like family and friendship, right? Lots of things can become idols in the sense that they become things that you value, things that you have. Remember that whole, like an idol is something that you enthrone in your heart. If any of these things become like the thing that you live for, the thing that you think about as the goal of your life, the thing to which you like dedicate your whole existence, that's the point at which it's become an idol. And so the demons are presenting these things to you in particular ways that make you desire them above your desire for everything else. Okay, so an important question, like there's those examples, but are any of those things, or any other examples of idols that you can think of, are they evil in and of themselves? Popularity, wealth, fame, family and friendship? Are any of those things evil in and of themselves? Okay, yeah, obviously not. And pretty much any sin you can think of, at the core of it, there's something that is not essentially evil, right? Like even lust, right? Sex is not evil. Pleasure is not evil even. Food is not evil. It's the misuse of it, right? It's that whole putting the creature over the creator. So the question is, I suppose I've kind of given you my confused version of it from my head, but I would like to hear if you're willing to share. What do you think so if we agree that things like this aren't evil in and of themselves, what is it about, like what kind of mental image do you have to have of them to make them into idols? What is it that makes your attitude to these idolatrous rather than just natural? What are some of the defining characteristics? Right, I really like that actually. Right, so you see more value in them than they actually have. And that's important because it's not to say that, like, we're not saying what the proper Christian attitude to these things is that they have no value, right? We can acknowledge that they have value, but it's about keeping it in the right space, right? It's valuable, but it's not more valuable than other things. All right, that's really good. Anything else? Any other? What makes an idolatrous attitude to something like that?
Did you say the intentions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could you give an example or like?
Like, for example, if you've got pure intentions, I guess you're not worshipping. But if your intentions aren't pure, if the kind of intentions are a bit more negative or
Selfish. Mm.
you could say that they're kind of you're worshipping something for the wrong reason.
Yes, okay, that's really good. Yeah, because that's a good point. You can pursue all of those things for good reasons, potentially, right? Especially things like family and friendship, right? Obviously, those are very good things. The only way, can you think of actually, I put them up there with the intent of trying to get you to think about it kind of thing. Can family and friendship, obviously I think they can become a kind of idol, but how? Like in what way could a friendship or like a desire for a family, which is a good Christian thing, how could that become an idol? Yeah.
I think like anything that you become obsessive about, or possessive about.
Possessive, yeah.
So like if I treat my family and friends as possession, that like I need it for myself, rather than I'm there to give to them. I'm actually I should be sacrificing myself to them as opposed to trying to like sort of grab a hold of them. I think that's what the issue is.
Yeah. That's really interesting. What's sticking out to me about what like you both were saying there is that I wonder if these things become idols when the thing at the center is actually yourself, right? When you're sitting at the center of your heart, when God should be there, then everything else that you do is kind of poisoned, right? Even your search for a family or for like a career or whatever becomes part of your like program of self-worship, and that's what twists it. That's really interesting. Okay, yeah, cool. Any other thoughts? I'm enjoying these. Okay. Could you go to the next slide? So I think to like the summary, you said basically what all of these quotes are saying, but the essential point about an idolatrous way of viewing something is, one, it's selfish, like it's focused completely on my own, like even if it doesn't feel like it, it's focused on benefiting myself. But two, it cuts God out of the equation. It's viewing the thing in and of itself without any regard for God. So one of the examples that Macarius Simeon gives is, well, this is a really disturbing passage of his writings, but it's one of the ones that stuck with my mind. But he's talking here about how the devil, by making people worship the idols of like material things, like the ones we were just talking about, the devil has kind of enslaved the whole human race. And the way that he explains it in this passage is he uses, there's that really, when Peter says, Christ says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter gets the right answer. He says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus speaks to him a little bit more afterwards. One of the things Jesus says to Peter, it's very easy to read over, but it's very troubling, is he says, "Satan has asked for you, Peter, in order to sift you as wheat." It's a really weird, there's no context given. He just drops that and then moves on. But in some sense, Satan has asked for Peter. Asked who? Presumably God. He wants Peter, and he wants to sift him as wheat. And sifting is a whole, like you have people still use them in cooking. A sieve is like a thing with the little holes in it so that the big bits stay in and the little bits fall out. And the point is that if you put something in a sieve, it's a very violent, it wouldn't be fun to be inside the sieve, if you're a piece of wheat or whatever. You're being shaken around and like totally dominated and controlled by the sieve. And so what Pseudo-Macarius says here, or Macarius Simeon, is that by enslaving human beings to idols, what he's effectively done is he's put all of the human race into a sieve, and now he's shaking them up and down. He says, "The inhabitants of this world are like wheat in a sieve. They're constantly tossed to and fro by earthly cares and desire and absorption in a variety of material concerns. Satan tosses such souls as a sifter sifts wheat. The prince of this world keeps each soul that is not reborn of God tossed on the waves of various passions and lusts." So what you could think of, the whole image of like a carrot on a stick, like you're on the horse and you're holding a stick out with a carrot. You can make the horse do whatever you want, right? Satan's controlling the human race in this way. And what's on the stick, it's not a carrot, it's an idol. Some aspect of worldly concern, like your career or your concern to be popular or your appearance or whatever it might be. And then anything that Satan does to that aspect of your life fills you with dread, right? If you're really attached to your family, for example, to the point that you put them above God, then you could be in a situation where you end up cursing God because of something that happens to your family, right? If the priorities are mixed up in that way. If you don't receive them as a gift from God, but you view them in and of themselves, then anything that happens to them could sever your relationship with God because the hierarchy is wrong. If you're really concerned about your career, right, and this happens all the time, doesn't it? We're all sort of tempted, but we really ask God for help in some other worldly endeavor, like an exam or career, like some important career event. And it's very clear that kind of like career is up the top, and we're asking God to kind of come in and help us in that other endeavor. And so, again, whatever happens with, like, our whole mental well-being kind of is bound up with this thing. And so now, you're put in this really sort of dangerous situation where your mental well-being and your health and happiness as a human being depends on this thing that's really not stable, right? Even family, right? Terrible things happen to people all the time, and we are all going to die. We can't hold on to our families forever. So even that can't be the ultimate thing that you rely on. If it is, then your fate is kind of bound up with it. So the point is that Satan is like binding us to things in the world, things that he has a measure of power over, because he's the prince of this world, or the ruler of this world, as, in one sense. Obviously God is the true ruler of the world, but yeah. Satan has a sort of temporary dominion over the sinful world. And so he controls us by kind of dragging us around after these idols. Next slide. And he goes on in the same passage a little bit. By means of a certain love for things of the world and the flesh, evil entices a human being until it becomes an enslaving bond, a heavy chain and weight that sucks him down and stifles him in a world of evil that does not allow him to rise up and return to God. The reason is that whatever anyone loves of the world oppresses his mind. So this is, again, it goes back to that whole point about how God doesn't ask for us to worship him alone because he wants to control us or deprive us of everything else. The point is that when you worship anything, even if it's a good thing in this way, in the way that we're supposed to like reserve for God, that thing kind of ends up sucking the life out of us, right? Even a concern for your family, right? If you view your children or your siblings or something in a way that kind of pushes God out of the equation and that tries to have total control over that situation, or use them just as like in a selfish way, like as part of your project, and is not willing to surrender that part of your life to God, then it ends up becoming a kind of toxic, cloying love that kind of sucks the life both out of you and out of the people that you're trying to love, right? I think that a lot of toxic relationships come from this kind of desire to like control the person rather than to have the person in your life as a gift from God, right? Allowing God to still be in control. Yeah. Okay, yeah, cool. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, you can skip that. Yeah, okay. And I suppose the last point to make here, I'm almost done, I promise, is the second last slide or so. But the only point to make here is that almost all the idols that we go after are actually usually unreal. Like, remember with the party example? Like, you're imagining what the party's like, but it's probably actually going to be very, very different. The key thing about idols, you remember all that stuff we said at the beginning about, like in the Old Testament, how like they have got mouths but they don't speak, and they've got eyes and they don't see. Because they're fake human beings, right? They're fake gods. Our idols, our mental idols of these worldly things are the same, right? They're fake. They promise to be a certain thing, but they never actually deliver. I won't read out that whole thing, but just that center part there. This is from the Philokalia. But St. Neelus says, we ourselves give idols substance when in our thoughts we shape fantasies about things that serve no real purpose. Wealth, fame, and other things of this life lack substance, for there's nothing clear and distinct about them. Point being that if you have an idol that you're following after in this way, you have a sense that it can give you like satisfaction and wholeness, and it will, if you just have this thing, then your life will be worth it and meaningful and pleasurable and all of those things. That's where the illusion comes in, right? It's not that wealth or fame or family are like non-existent. Obviously, they're real things. But the point is that it's the emotional part of that, or the desiring part of that image, which gives you the sense that owning this thing or achieving this goal will give you like ultimate meaning or purpose, the thing that makes you really desire it. That's where the fantasy comes in. Often the only way to like really know that is to get the thing, and then you realize that you're still unhappy. Okay, cool. So idols are unreal. Just like the ancient literal idols are just, plaster statues of human beings, not real human beings. One more. And the only other thing about why idols are so dangerous is that they, just like the idols of the Old Testament, these idols also demand sacrifice. That's part of what it means to be an idol in the biblical definition. And, in actual history, all of these idols that I was talking about, like the way that you worship them, is like the example I gave, you have to sacrifice things. You usually involves the blood of a goat or a bull or a dove or something like that. In some cases, very rare cases, it was human sacrifice, right? It would always involve blood of some kind. Something has to be destroyed to satisfy the idol. But the same thing is true of the idols that I've been talking about, these less physical idols, these things that we kind of dedicate ourselves to. Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, in a beautiful little interview, which you can watch on YouTube, the way he put it is, there's no idol that doesn't claim blood. And the blood is always human blood. It will always be men and women and children who will have to pay the cost of it. So an important question, and this is the last thing before we finish really, but I'd be interested to see what, with the examples that we've spoken about, in the same way that pagan idols used to demand that you sacrifice living things to them, how do our idols claim blood? In what way can your idolatrous love for your career or your whatever, family, popularity, wealth, whatever, in what way can that cause you to then shed blood? And I'm not talking literally, obviously, right? You're not going to go and murder someone necessarily. You might. Time? Right. Yeah, so you pour time into... So in that sense, it's kind of like your own blood, right? That's your own energy, your own life essence that you're pouring into this thing. And you're not really getting anything back out of it. It's just sucking you dry like a vampire kind of thing. Okay, yeah, that's good. All right, so time. Some idols demand time. Anything else? Is it always your own blood and that's a case where you're sacrificing your own time and effort and that sort of thing. Do we ever sacrifice other people to our idols? Mm-hmm.
You might, some people have this ideology of like the only way they can be on top of people others down.
Yeah, that's right. Has anyone watched Adorawabi School for Girls on Netflix? It's this Jordanian, highly recommend. It's only 6 episodes. Very good, very, very good, but very good illustration of that. It's just like, yeah, Jordanian kind of soap. I never thought I would watch it, to be honest. Like, it's not the sort of thing that, but it's very good and a very good illustration of that. But yeah, like, so, I mean, popularity, think of a high school setting. Think of the kinds of things that in order to gain popularity, you might have to do that might involve harming someone else, right? Often, a good way to like climb up the ranks, and this could be in your career or anywhere, is it involves some sort of harm to another person. That's a key defining characteristic of an idol. And notice, again, if you worship God, He never demands that of you, right? Worshipping God never requires you to harm another person. It might require you to do something that another person doesn't like in some circumstances, but you never have to sacrifice someone or something or someone like in order to worship God properly. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Next slide. Okay. So what's the solution to all this? How do we avoid idolatry? How do we get rid of the idols from our hearts? To kind of continue this theme of the temple, your heart is an altar for God. And, well, I'll just let St. Anthony speak for himself here. This is one of the letters of St. Anthony, the Great. And this is one of, like, his advice to some spiritual children. He says, "Lift up your body in which you are clothed and make it an altar, and lay upon it all your thoughts and all evil counsels, and leave all evil counsels before God. Lift up the hands of your heart to Him," that is, to the Creator of the mind, "and pray to God that He gives you the great invisible fire that may descend from above and consume the altar and all upon it, as well as all the priests of Baal who are the hostile works of the enemy, that they may flee before you as the prophet Elijah." Isn't that beautiful? So he's taking the story of, the famous story of Elijah, like in that duel with the prophets of Baal, like they challenge each other's gods to see who can burn up the thing on the altar. And Elijah like pours water over it to sort of show off. He's made that about your mind, right? The idols in your mind are these things that you have attachment to that are kind of taking the place of God. And so what you do is you do exactly what Elijah did, right? You beg God, you come to God, and it's His presence that will destroy all the idols. And like to sort of put that in more relatable terms, what I think, at least in my experience, what that means is that remember that idols are always illusions, they're always false. What happens when you encounter God is the real thing kind of like overshadows and outperforms the illusion, right? When you, the only example that's coming to mind is like, those really cheap, like the ePhone, like that you can get for like $5 on eBay. So you don't want to pay for an iPhone, so you get an ePhone, which is like a very clear copy that's made out of plastic and like it's really clearly not. And I don't think that's much of a thing anymore. But like back when the iPhone came out, that was a thing. So the point would be like that you could be sort of satisfied with an ePhone until you saw an actual iPhone. And then you would see, oh, okay, this thing is a poor imitation of the real thing, right? And the point would be that in the same way, it's a terrible analogy the more I think about it. Don't forget it. But the more that you actually encounter the real thing that gives you what we think the idols are going to give us, like joy and satisfaction and pleasure and all of that, the false versions kind of look less and less appealing. And that is in lots of ways what I think in the, what you see in the lives of the saints, the way that they overcome their sins gradually, is that they no longer see sin as desirable. It's not just that they're kind of sitting there really wanting to sin and sort of like resisting. They do, like that's the first stage, obviously. But like the extreme desert fathers, the ones that reach the really high spiritual level, there's lots of beautiful stories about they'll walk past a piece of gold on the side of the road and they won't even notice it. The point is it looks to them like a normal rock because their spiritual eyes are so in tune with God that, yeah, sure, it's a shiny piece of metal. It has no real value to Him, right? They don't partake in the whole, like, the game of wealth and power and everything like that. It has no real, yeah. So the presence of God kind of outshines everything else and allows you to use everything else in the way that it was designed to be used. Okay, yeah, you can go skip 2 slides. So I think we've already gone like over time. So you can probably stop there. But there are some discussion questions for your own thoughts, unless anyone wants to say anything now. Maybe just quickly give me, like, what do you think are our society's big idols, or in your own life, what you encounter as major idols today? That's really interesting, because that ties very well with the whole theme of images and images being unreal, you know, like these sort of like fake versions of our lives and of other people's lives that we desire. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, any others? I think success is a big one.
Yeah, and speaking of, like, you were speaking before about drawing blood, success is a big one. Like,
Yeah.
even the other side of social media, like LinkedIn, you see success and it's this, like, it's painted like an amazing picture, but love that people have drawn.
Yeah.
To get to there and, like,
100%.
you see the nice side of success.
100%. I feel like, yeah, that's a really good way to tell that something's become an idol, is the way that it makes you treat other people. One of the, I mean, I didn't go into this, but one of the really important points, it sounds controversial, but it's really, like, obvious once you think about it, but the church and Christianity can be an idol, right, if you separate them from Christ. And the way that you can tell that something like that has become an idol is the way that it makes you treat other people, right? Like, when, you know, the things that you see people do, or that, you know, we ourselves do to other people out of a desire to, like, defend the church or defend Christianity, often is a good sign that, you know, like, would Christ talk to that person that way to defend his church, to do something like that? That's a good sign that what you're worshipping is not Christ's church, but like an idol of the church, if it makes you draw blood from someone else. So yeah, I think that's really important. Like, it's a good test.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because, like, I think sometimes, like, we hear it every now and then, but, like, you know, we might call, you know, someone from another particular denomination might say, oh, you know, they're heretic. I think that's where they're sort of like, you know,
Yeah, obviously I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with, you know, like, defending the faith and standing up for the truth and everything. But there are ways to do it and there are ways not to do it. And it's very easy to think you're being very righteous while, you know, clearly you're actually just serving an idol kind of thing. Yeah. Cool. All right. I think we'll stop there. Thank you, guys.